Other member, the Honourable David Canterbury.
Mr Speaker, the Labour opposition rises to address this important issue around the receivership of South Canterbury Finance and the additional liability that the public of New Zealand now has to the tune initially of $1.75 billion. Mr Speaker, last Tuesday, the 31st of August, South Canterbury Finance was placed in receivership, triggering the Crown Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme, under which South Canterbury Finance's deposit holders are to be paid $1.6 billion. In addition, $175 million has been loaned to the receiver, which will allow the government to repay all of South Canterbury Finance's prior ranking debts and become the first ranking creditor. Once South Canterbury Finance's assets are sold off, the government expects to make a net loss of around $600 million, which the Minister of Finance has argued in the House just previously could be reduced to $300 to $400 million net of the interest received under the scheme. Mr Speaker, this is the largest bailout in New Zealand corporate history. The events leading up to the receivership raise some serious questions. The public, who is now footing the bill, is entitled to know what went wrong, when, why, and who was involved. Kiwis deserve clarity and transparency about how the government and its regulators handled the bailout and whether the cost to the taxpayer was in fact minimised. We are asking these questions so that we can learn the lessons of South Canterbury Finance and ensure that something like this does not happen again. Mr Speaker, there are a wide range of detailed questions that need to be addressed. Firstly, should South Canterbury Finance have been included in the extended scheme guarantee? Did South Canterbury Finance breach its deed of guarantee? On what date did Cordamentha start advising the government on South Canterbury Finance? There have been reports this happened in mid-2009. It was clear that South Canterbury had substantial difficulties, and some at that point thought it was destined to fail. So what advice did the government then get from Cordamentha? Did Cordamentha reach the same conclusions as Ernst & Young, who said that there were fundamental uncertainties about South Canterbury Finance's financial position? Was South Canterbury Finance in breach of the Reserve Bank's prudential requirements for inclusion in the guarantee when it was accepted for the extended scheme on April Fool's Day? Given the state of its balance sheet, it must have been. Its half-yearly report, released in April, showed a huge loss. Why did the government act then as it did? Had Treasury seen South Canterbury Finance's latest audit accounts when it announced that the finance scheme would be included in the extended guarantee? Was South Canterbury Finance in breach of the deed of guarantee when it was included in the extended scheme? South Canterbury Finance's business practices suggest it may not have been meeting the standards of prudence required by the deed. What, for example, were the level of related party transactions at that time, and how did that relate to the criteria set out in the deed? Could the government have tightened the terms of the deed of guarantee under the extended scheme? Could the taxpayer's liability therefore have been limited in that way? Mr Speaker, the public of New Zealand will want to know whether the government did indeed minimise the cost to the taxpayer. How many deposits did South Canterbury Finance attract after its inclusion in the extended guarantee scheme? South Canterbury Finance released... Mr Speaker, South Canterbury Finance... Mr Speaker, point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable. Order. Point of order has been called.
Mr Speaker, the opposition has done the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance the courtesy of, on this serious matter, listening to their remarks without interruption, and we would ask that that courtesy be reciprocated.
Order. It's not an unreasonable request, and the opposition did accord the Minister of Finance the courtesy of listening to him in silence. I would ask the House try and avoid interjection, please. The Honourable David.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How many deposits did South Canterbury Finance attract after its inclusion in the extended guarantee scheme? It released a prospectus in early April that sought to raise $1.2 billion in registered debentures. The government's decision to extend the guarantee gave investors the confidence to make new deposits with South Canterbury Finance, even though the company was already in a bad state. There may have been reports in the media about a potential commercial deal that would have greatly reduced the Crown and taxpayers' liability. Apparently, negotiations only ended at 4:30 a.m. on the night before the receivership was announced. What deals were on the table? Was someone interested in buying a share of equity in South Canterbury Finance, possibly preventing the need for a bailout? We have heard that there were reputable parties willing to invest hundreds of millions of dollars of their own equity. This would have greatly reduced the taxpayers' liability. Having made the decision to include South Canterbury in the extended order, why did the government not give Sandy Meyer, the chief executive, a chance to recapitalise the company, and why did those negotiations fail at the last moment? What was the sequencing of Cabinet's consideration of the recapitalisation proposal relative to the timing of those negotiations? What other options did the government consider before South Canterbury was put into receivership? It seems the government's moves were pre-planned, given the speed of their implementation. Did they really give recapitalisation every chance to succeed? Sir, the government has said that the minimum cost to the taxpayer would be around $600 million, assuming that the government can realise the full value of all of South Canterbury Finance's assets. The opposition asks whether that cost could in the end be more. Sir, it is clear that assets held in receivership typically erode value. Faced with the choice between ceasing business as usual as a going concern or being sold to circulating speculators at fire sale prices, what scenarios has the government planned as to the value loss of the assets currently held by the receiver, and how will that loss be minimised? Mr. Speaker, the opposition and the public will be interested in the process that the government went through, putting the House under urgency without a select committee process to extend the guarantee scheme. Labor voted for that, passed in September of last year. However, at the time we made the point that the legislation should have gone to a select committee, even if it was only for a compressed period of time. And sir, I believe that history has shown that to be a good and proper instinct. Mr. Speaker, did putting Alan Hubbard into statutory management exacerbate South Canterbury Finance's troubles? Sir, it is clear that there are matters currently under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office which this House cannot have visibility into. But nonetheless, on June the 20th, Minister Power announced on advice of the Securities Commission that he was placing the Hubbards, Outing Securities and 7 charitable trusts under statutory management. Some matters were referred to the Serious Fraud Office. While South Canterbury was not part of the order, it must have been affected by the loss of confidence in its principal, Alan Hubbard. Because of the statutory management and the SFO investigations ongoing, the public has little information about what led to the government's decision. No doubt more will be known when these matters are concluded. But after the announcement, my colleague Leanne Dalzell wrote to Minister Power expressing her concern that placing Alan Hubbard under statutory management at a time when SCF was trying to raise funds was difficult to understand. Did the government factor in South Canterbury before making the statutory management order? Did the government consider the effect of the decision on South Canterbury and the effect of the retail deposit scheme? Mr. Speaker, taxpayers will wish to assess who were the eventual winners and losers in this debacle. The government has paid out 1.70 or loaned 1.75 billion to South Canterbury's receivers and depositors, more than the annual budget allocation for police, and even after the assets are sold, it could be $600 million in the red. The companies who borrowed off South Canterbury will now be struggling as receivers cut up their credit cards and shut off their credit lines. However, some companies with senior registered debt, sir, have stood to make a very handsome return from their investments in this process. The public will want to understand more about how those circumstances arose. Mr. Speaker, were there conflicts of interest? Some serious questions need to be asked about the transparency and integrity of the government's processes. What assurances did the government seek that all private parties were free of conflicts of interest? What conflicts of interest were declared to the government? What steps, if any, were taken to mitigate any conflicts of interests? These are issues we will examine in more detail.